I've been a trucker for as long as I can remember. If you were to ask me what sets a sailor apart from someone like me, I'd say it's pretty simple. It all depends on the ocean we navigate. Sailors ride the waves of the sea, but us truckers we sail the endless highways, which are paved in asphalt. That's whether the comparison is irrelevant. It's all about what you're crossing. I finished high school back in 1980 in the middle of the Midwest, where I grew up on a farm. However, farming wasn't what I wanted for my future, so I took a different path, trade school. I learned how to drive big rigs, and the school even lined up a job for me once I graduated. With the money I had saved, it seemed like everything was falling into place, just as I'd hoped. My name is Daniel, and trucking quickly became my passion. Over time, I set aside a portion of my earnings with one goal in mind, owning my own rig. That's where the real opportunity is. Whenever I wasn't on the road, I picked up local gigs. I worked short hauls and other gigs to put more aside. I traveled all over, from the tips of the continental U.S. down into Mexico, even up into Canada, covering nearly every corner of the map during my years on the road. Eventually, I had saved enough to finally buy my own truck. It wasn't brand new, but it was well maintained. I learned a lot about keeping machinery running on the farm, so I invested most of my savings and bought it outright. I had just enough left over to make a few customizations and gave her an appropriate name. People raised their eyebrows at first, but once I explained the name, they got it. I continued my long hauls and made plenty of friends along the way. Other truckers shared their wisdom on routes and tips for the road ahead. The life of a long-haul trucker is filled with its own kind of adventure, and I enjoyed every bit of it. I remember one trip in particular where a sudden snowstorm hit while I was heading south. It completely covered the road, forcing me to pull off at a truck stop that had all the essentials: fuel, a diner, and a motel. Normally, I'd stay in the truck, but that freezing weather had other ideas. I booked a room later that night. One trip in particular, I was heading south and a sudden snowstorm hit. The road was completely covered, so I had to pull off at a truck stop that had everything I needed: fuel, a restaurant, and a motel. Normally, I'd stay in the truck, but that freezing weather had other ideas. I booked a room later that one night while I was trying to get through a boring TV show. Chaos erupted in the room next door. It turned out that a trucker's wife had caught him with another woman. There was shouting, slamming of doors, and all kinds of ruckus, but I knew the roads would be clear in the morning, so I decided to wait it out until 5:30 a.m. I was up, had my rig running, and grabbed breakfast at the diner while the truck warmed up. Midway through my meal, the woman from the commotion walked up and sat down next to me. She introduced herself as Julie. I wasn't exactly eager to chat, but I figured it'd beat talking to myself. Plus, there was something about her, an easy charm. She told me she was trying to make her way back home to Tulsa before winter hit. Julie explained the previous night's uproar, saying it had all been a misunderstanding. Julie told me that she had caught a ride with the trucker and his wife 3 days ago. Even though they were in the same room, they hadn't shared a bed. The place had 2 double beds, one for him and one for her. They convinced the wife that nothing had happened by showing her the messed up sheets on both beds. There were no signs of anything suspicious. Julie had stayed the night, but alone. Eventually, the situation cooled down. She went on to tell me that she had been hitchhiking across the country for a few months later. She hoped to be home in a few more weeks. She enjoyed the trucker's view and the break from having to drive herself. Curious about where I was headed, she asked about my route. I told her I was heading south and offered her a seat in my truck. No strings attached. To my surprise, she accepted, and we hit the road together. I knew I'd be picking up a few trick loads before we reached Tulsa, but I didn't mind the scenery, and her company made it worth it. Julie wasn't much of a burden either. She paid for most of her own meals, and the only real cost I had was the showers we rented. Every couple of days we drove together for about 2 weeks, and things ran smoothly the entire time. We made a quick stop for fuel and food, figuring we'd get back on the road in an hour. Julie excused herself to use the restroom, telling me to head on back to the truck. She'd meet me in a few minutes. I wandered through the store for a bit, then headed back to the landship. I noticed the curtains on both doors. The windshield was closed, but I didn't think much of it. I climbed in, and Julie told me she was changing. She asked me to go ahead and drive. I barely got the truck back into gear when she stepped out of the sleeper cab, half naked. Okay, this was unexpected. She sat down next to me, calm as ever, and started chatting as if nothing unusual was happening. I wasn't prepared for this. I'd heard stories from other truckers about wives, girlfriends, and hitchhikers doing this sort of thing, but I'd never experienced it. Julie was already pretty when she was dressed, but like this she was stunning. Her blonde hair, cute little nose, and freckles everywhere, she was more than I could have imagined. We drove for about 2 hours before we found a decent place to pull over. It was one of those roadside areas for truckers to take a break. She stayed next to me the whole time, completely comfortable in her skin, acting like nothing out of the ordinary was happening. As soon as we stopped, the curtains were drawn again. We spent the next 2 hours or so enjoying each other's company. It was the best I'd ever had. What surprised me the most was that nothing had been discussed beforehand. We hadn't planned any of it. It just happened as we neared Tulsa. I could have sensed some sadness in her. I felt it too, knowing we'd probably go our separate ways in a couple of days. When the time came, she confessed that she didn't want me to leave her. She didn't want us to part ways. I wasn't sure what to say. I liked her, but I couldn't. After our final meal together, we were ready to say goodbye. That's when she dropped the bomb. She told me she thought she was falling in love with me and asked if I really had to leave her behind. I didn't have the words. I knew it would be tough to find someone like her again, but I also knew it might be better to go our separate ways. I gave her my phone number and told her there was a chance for her to join me as a coworker. She'd have to attend a 6-month truck driving school to get her commercial driver's license. I promised to come back and pick her up after she completed the program. She agreed and kept in regular contact for a couple of weeks after we parted ways. Julie called with some exciting news. She had enrolled in a driving school and promised to keep me posted with weekly updates. Despite this, our conversations began to stretch into 2-hour calls every other night. We ended up talking for an hour every other night. We covered everything from the technical details of driving to load management and even touched on her experience with school. Julie was curious about every part of the job and wanted to understand the industry inside and out. We also talked about our personal relationship, which had blossomed during our time on the road. We discussed our goals and feelings openly. During one of these talks, I made it clear that I wanted to be with someone who was exclusive. I made sure she knew I wasn't the kind of man who was okay with sharing, especially when it came to physical intimacy. Kissing, touching, there could be no other guy in the picture. I was a one-woman man, and I expected the same level of commitment in return. No room for exceptions. We began mapping out the boundaries of what we could and couldn't accept in a relationship. I even told her about my parents. They'd been together exclusively since they were teenagers. My mom was just 16 when they got married, and my dad was 19. To my surprise, Julie agreed with every word. Then she shared a bit about we discussed the boundaries of what we could and couldn't accept in a relationship. I even told her about my parents and how they had been together exclusively since they were teenagers. My mom was just 16 when they got married, and my dad was 19. To my surprise, Julie agreed with every word. Then she shared a bit about she had 2 younger brothers and a sister. I told her about my 2 brothers, one older and one younger, and how we were raised on that farm. She knew my story, but she was a bit vague when it came to her parents. She didn't talk about them much, and I couldn't. I couldn't help but wonder if she was particularly proud of what they did for a living. Still, I knew that if we were going to drive together long term, I'd eventually have to meet them. 5.5 months later, Julie called again. This time, she had even better news. She had earned her commercial driver's license. She asked me. I told her it'd take about 3 weeks to get to her, as I was 7 states away at the time. During that call, I mentioned wanting to meet her parents and siblings. She wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea, but she agreed to set up a gathering at her parents' place. When I got to town, I arrived 2 days earlier than planned and dropped my trailer off at a truck stop before driving straight to her house. My early arrival definitely caught her off guard. She lived just outside of Tulsa in a quiet community. Julie explained that her parents lived about 50 miles away. She seemed a bit unsure at first, but she made the call to her folks and they said it was fine with them. We made plans for 3 days later as we drove toward her parents' place. I couldn't help but notice that we weren't headed for the wrong side of town, quite the opposite. When we arrived at the gated community where her parents lived, I noticed that the homes there were very expensive. We pulled up in front of a small mansion. I felt a bit out of place, and I realized I probably wasn't dressed appropriately for this kind of meeting. To make matters worse, both of her parents were high. I was meeting with some pretty powerful lawyers who were successful enough to run their own business with a few partners. I wasn't sure whether I should go in or bolt like a scared dog. It felt awkward as hell, and I was desperate for a way to handle it. Sensing my hesitation, Julie reassured me, "We're here. It's going to be fine." She reminded me that no one was going to bite. She encouraged me to get out of the car and just be myself. To my surprise, her parents were down to earth and genuine, despite their wealth and status. They were more concerned about their daughter learning to drive a massive rig across the country than anything else. I told them how Julie and I had met, sharing stories from our 4-week trip to Tulsa. During our week-long trip to Tulsa, we discussed the financial aspects of owning a truck versus working for someone else. I highlighted the strong sense of camaraderie among truckers, emphasizing how once you make friends on the road, those bonds tend to last. Most of us look out for each other like family, and while there are few bad apples, they're few and far between. That gives us a bad name, but I told them that most truckers are decent folks who are just trying to do their jobs and get back to their loved ones. Thankfully, the day went better than I'd hoped. I found myself liking her family a lot, and it seemed the feeling was mutual. I proposed. I offered Julie 30% of the load's earnings, which was more than she'd make working for most companies. The rest would cover things like maintenance, fuel, food, showers, and other expenses related to keeping our landship running. Her dad suggested we put it all in writing, but I only wanted to do it if Julie was okay with it. She told them she trusted me, pointing out that I was the only person she had ever spent more than a few days with while on the road. She assured them I was upfront and honest. Her mom was still cautious, but she left the decision to me. I decided to go ahead with the arrangement, telling them let's make it official. I've got nothing to hide. We signed a contract that outlined how each load would be split. While I might lose a little in the short term, the benefits of having a team driver far outweighed the costs. Especially since we didn't have to stop as often as solo drivers do. Over the next 9 months, Julie and I traveled the highways, sometimes stopping off at her parents' place or visiting my family's farm. The Landstar racked up over 2 million miles, and the wear and tear started showing. I was hesitant, but I knew it was time for a new rig. The signs were clear, both cosmetically and mechanically. The old girl was getting tired, with my detailed records and savings. I managed to strike a good deal on a brand new Kenworth because of my simple lifestyle. I only needed to finance about 25% of the cost. It was around this time that Julie approached me, asking if we could have a private chat. We sat down, and she suggested something that caught me off guard. She wanted to cover half the cost of the new truck and proposed we go 50-50 on all expenses and have an equal partnership with no strings attached. I wasn't against the idea, but given that the rig I had my eyes on was around $200, I thought it'd be a good idea to run things by her parents. Julie wasn't having it, though. She said she was of legal age and didn't need their approval for decisions like this. I didn't have much choice, so I agreed but told her we should put everything in writing to protect us both. If she changed her mind later, she wasn't happy about the paperwork, but she agreed. During this period, our relationship continued to thrive, both on the road and off. We shared intimate moments as often as we could, and after 9 months of we'd been driving together for about 15 months in total. I cared for her deeply, and I was pretty sure she felt the same way. Even when one of us was sick, we made sure the loads were still delivered while taking care of each other along the way. By the time we started our first journey in Landship 2, our relationship was really strong. One night on our way to California, she accidentally let something slip. She mumbled that she loved me as she drifted off to sleep. Hearing those words made me pause. Was this just the natural outcome of our time together, or was there more to it than the business partnership? It got me thinking that we had a day layover before our next load, so I booked a motel room and rented a car for us to explore the nearby area on the first day. We were acting like a couple of carefree teenagers, even getting into some backseat action in the rental car. By the second day, we were lounging by the motel pool, watching kids play in the water, while we soaked up the relaxation. At some point, Julie leaned over and asked what I thought about those kids. I told her I wanted to be a dad one day, but I added that I needed to be sure the woman I married could handle the life of a trucker's wife despite my love for the road. She responded in a way I didn't expect. She shoved me right out of my chair, sending me straight into the pool with one push. She stormed off back to the room without saying a word, leaving me soaking wet and confused. I sat there trying to piece together what had just happened. Together, I thought about what had just happened. Then it hit me. 2 nights ago, I had heard her whisper that she loved me as she was falling asleep. Now it made sense. Over the past 17 months, Julie had become everything to me. I hadn't fully realized it until that moment. I hadn't been with anyone else since meeting her back in South Dakota. Not even when she was away in driving school. I was determined to make things right. I dried off and I cleaned up in the room and left without telling her where I was going. I drove around for a couple of hours and found what I needed. When I got back to the motel, I found Julie fast asleep. Her eyes were puffy from crying, so I made sure not to wake her. I quietly slipped out and went to the flower shop next to the motel. I bought 6 dozen roses, red, yellow, orange, and purple. The purple ones were especially expensive, but I didn't care. I knew they would be worth it. I went back to the room and carefully removed the petals from all but the purple roses, scattering them throughout the room in a beautiful display. I put the purple roses in a vase with a note attached that simply read, "To Julie, I know I'm slow to realize things, but it hit me today that we're in love, so I just want to say I love you." I sat in the front half of the room and waited for a few minutes. I heard her stirring and let out a soft gasp as she saw the petals covering the floor and the purple roses waiting for her. She let out a soft gasp when she saw the petals covering the floor and the purple roses waiting for her as she approached them. This time, she was crying with a different kind of emotion. She turned, spotted me, and before I knew it, we tumbled onto the bed together. Julie was always passionate, but this side of her intensity was something new. We spent the next 6 hours together, and sleep wasn't on the agenda. When exhaustion finally hit, we were still going strong. We both fell asleep, but when we woke up, she was still full of energy, and we couldn't resist indulging in another intimate moment. I couldn't help but think of the old Jackie Gleason line, "How sweet it is." I had to plan ahead, though. Julie's birthday was coming up in 3 weeks, and I wanted to make sure we'd be back in Tulsa to celebrate with her family. I had some other surprises in mind, too. During the 2 hours I was out of the room, I called. I also called her parents to make arrangements for a surprised birthday party. I filled them in on where our relationship was at and asked them to make sure her whole family would be there. When we arrived in Landship 2, we drove right into their gated community. I'm sure a big rig pulling into such an upscale neighborhood turned more than a few heads, but we didn't mind. We wanted to make an entrance when we pulled up to her parents' house around 10:12 a.m. Her whole family was already there. It had been almost a year since we'd spent quality time with them, and I wasn't sure how things would go. I just hoped it would all go according to plan. The party was a hit, full of joy and excitement around 2 p.m. Her dad stood up to make a birthday toast as soon as the cheers died down. I took my chance and went over to Julie. I knelt down and proposed. I told her that we'd been through a lot together in the past 2 years. We traveled across the country and become partners, both in life and in love. I said, watching her face flush with emotion, that we're already equal partners on landship too. So now I'm asking, will you be my life partner and marry me? She was overcome with happiness and practically tackled me, kissing me over and over. Then she cried. With eyes filled with tears, she whispered, yes. Even though her parents had already given me their blessing, Julie still sought their approval. Her dad, always the joker, teased her about the life of a trucker's wife, saying he'd be there to support them both. I knew how it would all end, and I couldn't help but smirk. After the proposal, her dad walked her over to me one last time, emphasizing, take care of my little girl. He knew I would. We left with the promise to return once her mom had everything in place for the wedding. We kept in daily contact with her family, even managing to stay connected during stretches where we didn't have self during those times. We made pit stops at truck stops, fueled up, grabbed a quick bite, and always made sure to call her parents. We knew my folks would want to be part of the big day, so we worked out how to get them there, even if it meant covering their expenses. My dad is a farmer, so he didn't have much extra money for things that weren't essential. It was a real luxury to be able to make essential trips to town for supplies. Thankfully, Julie and I had already made visits to see them, so they knew her and they genuinely liked her. It made things a little smoother for everyone. One day, I had a conversation with her dad about a prenuptial agreement I wanted to make. My idea was to make it clear that I wasn't interested in their money or property. It was a bit surprising for both her parents, but after discussing it thoroughly, they relaxed when the time came. I had no problem signing the agreement. I knew in my heart I was doing the right thing, and I was confident Julie felt the same way. We exchanged. The ceremony was held at the church where Julie grew up, with her pastor, who had been part of her life since childhood, officiating. About 200 of her family members attended, and I was surprised to see that more than 100 of mine showed up. Our mothers had teamed up to make sure as many of our relatives could attend as possible. What amazed me was that her father was kind enough to pay for everything for my family. He even arranged for a motel nearby to rent out rooms for the event. The reception took place in the ballroom of the motel. I was really touched by his generosity. I later found out that the entire wedding cost over $150. He said he wanted Julie's wedding to be a once-in-a-lifetime event. He spared no expense to make it happen. I thanked him and told him I hoped it would be her one and only wedding. I was committed to making sure it would last. Time has flown by, and now, almost 5 decades later, Julie and I are celebrating our 49th wedding anniversary. Over the years, we expanded our fleet to 15 trucks, each no more than 5 years old. They're proudly displaying each truck has its own unique fleet number, so there's no confusion when we trade them in. Our family has grown with 7 children and 2 grandchildren, and our team of drivers feels like an extended family. The latest edition, Landship 34, shows how far we've come and our dedication to the business. Julie and I have slowly stepped back from the day-to-day running of the business. After a long and fruitful career, we're now handing over the reins of the business to our eldest daughter. She's got her mother's looks and my sense of duty, and she's even designed her own mini rig, which perfectly reflects her passion for the road. It may be built on a Chevy frame, but it carries the same spirit as Landship 2. It's amazing to think how 2 people from similar backgrounds could come together and make their dream a reality. We've had the chance to travel through 49 states, explore much of Canada, and even venture into Mexico. Looking back on our incredible journey, we're now thinking about our next adventure. We're considering a 6-month trip. We're planning a month-long adventure, driving around the beautiful islands of Hawaii to finally complete our journey through all 50 states. Thanks for watching this emotional story of love, lust, and lies. We hope it touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a fresh story every day. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so feel free to share your experiences and tell your story.